How you doing, Zaydes? It's my found E. I'm sending you this video to let you know I wish you well. And you can do anything you put your mind to. With hard work and dedication, it's nothing you can't do. I hope this video made you smile. For sure.
Good evening, I'm Anne-Marie Scottsoff, and we start here at 6 with this, a search for answers. After this prominent local musical artist is killed, gunned down overnight on the east side of Indianapolis.
$750,000. That's the number somebody close to Eric Butler is putting out there right now, today, as the reason a 35-year-old rapper from Indianapolis is dead. Not a robbery gone wrong. Not random street violence. A debt owed to a cartel large enough to get a man shot once and survive it, then shot again 6 weeks later and not survive at all. He was found just after 2 in the morning on a quiet stretch of Franklin Road on the east side of Indianapolis. Inside a car, gunshot wounds, multiple of them, and by the time paramedics got him to Ashkenazi Hospital, there was nothing left to do. The man known across that city as Lil E was pronounced dead within the hour. No suspect named that night. No motive given, just a body, a closed investigation file with more questions than answers, and somewhere out there, somebody already talking about 750,000 reasons why. If that number's real, this channel exists to tell you the truth about it instead of the comfortable version. Stay through this one. Subscribe if it earns your trust, and let's find out what actually happened to him. So, let's earn that number instead of just repeating it. Because to understand whether it's plausible, you have to understand who Eric Butler actually was. And I want to warn you now, he doesn't fit cleanly into either box people want to put him in. Not the talented kid who made it out, and not simply the criminal who had it coming. Resist both instincts with me, because the truth sits somewhere in between, and that's exactly where this case gets interesting. Lil E was a real presence in Indianapolis hip-hop. Hardly Breathe pulled in millions of views. He built over a decade of credibility in that scene, the kind you don't manufacture with a marketing budget. You earn it record by record, in front of an audience that knows the difference between authentic and performed. If you grew up in that city, there's a real chance you knew his music before you ever knew his name was Eric Butler. He had a real following, people who quoted his lyrics back to him in the comments, people who saw him as proof that you could come out of that environment and build something with your name instead of your record sheet. That's not nothing, and I don't think it should get erased by what comes next, because the other half of his identity started long before the music ever did. When Butler was just 22 years old, police arrested him during a traffic stop near West 38th Street, accusing him of opening fire on 2 men outside a gas station and killing 30-year-old Tommy Thompson. He was charged with murder. I want you to sit with that for a second, because that means of violence in his life wasn't something he picked up later after fame complicated things. It was there from the very beginning, years before anyone outside Indianapolis had ever heard his name. Whatever happened with that case in court, the simple fact that it existed tells you something important. This was a man who was already deep in something dangerous well before he ever stepped near a microphone. By the time he was in his 30s, Butler was affiliated with the Grundy Crew, an organization built by a man named Richard Grundy III. Some be federal investigators connected to as many as 10 homicides before they ever secured a single conviction against him. And here's something worth understanding about how cases like that actually get built. Law enforcement rarely convicts on the violence itself, because proving murder inside an organized network is brutally difficult. Witnesses disappear, get intimidated, or simply refuse to talk. So prosecutors use a tool that actually works. They convict on the weight. The Grundy operation moved roughly 400 pounds of methamphetamine through that city, plus thousands of pounds of marijuana and substantial amount of heroin and cocaine, generating millions of dollars before federal agents finally took it apart. Grundy himself was eventually sentenced to life in federal prison, with no possibility of parole, and more than 20 members of his crew were convicted alongside him. That's the structure Eric Butler was operating inside. Not a loose group of guys from the same neighborhood. An actual criminal enterprise, with a hierarchy, a supply chain, and a body count law enforcement couldn't even fully account for. Butler held enough standing inside that structure that when state police raided a property tied to him years later, in September 2024, he tried to escape through an attic window rather than face them. 14 people came out of that house before he finally did. They found marked currency on him from a controlled drug buy. They found an Atlas key that opened the back door of the property, the kind of thing you only get if you actually run part of the operation. And they found a gold chain around his neck, inscribed with the words, "Must obey bosses forever." Think about what that detail actually tells you, not what prosecutors said about him in a charging document. What he chose to wear against his own skin, every day, in public. That's a man who understood exactly where he stood inside that world, and wasn't hiding it from the people who mattered to him. Now, here's the detail that complicates everything, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets. In February of 2025, a jury acquitted him on those exact charges. Not guilty of dealing cocaine. Not guilty of dealing a narcotic drug. Not guilty of unlawfully possessing a firearm as a serious violent felon. Across the board, not guilty. So whatever ultimately got him killed wasn't the conclusion of a legal process that had already run its course and found him liable. The system looked at the evidence against him and let him walk. Somebody outside that system reached an entirely different verdict, and they reached it with bullets instead of evidence. Hold on to that contradiction with me, because I think it's the actual key to this whole case. A man legally cleared, publicly building something real with his music, walking around acquitted and seemingly free, and still living inside a structure dangerous enough to involve the kind of money we're talking about. If a debt like $750,000 genuinely existed, it didn't start the week he died. Debts that size don't appear overnight. They build slowly, sitting underneath everything else a person is doing, growing quietly while the rest of their life looks completely normal from the outside. Which brings us to April, and to something else that happened just weeks before that. On May 5th, a producer and rapper named Playboy the Great, signed to Boozy Badass's label, was murdered at his East Side apartment. Indianapolis lost two prominent figures from the same hip-hop scene within the span of about 6 weeks, and while investigators don't believe the two cases are connected, I want you to think about what that means for the climate Butler was living in. This wasn't a city where one isolated incident happened to him. This was a city where violence against people in his exact world was already escalating before he was even shot the first time. Because in April, Butler himself was shot outside a business on the East Side, an auto repair shop less than a mile from where he'd eventually die. And against the odds, he survived. No suspect named publicly. No motive ever confirmed. The case went quiet, the way an uncomfortable number of non-fatal shootings in that city eventually do. Not solved, just absorbed into the background noise of a place that sees far too much of this to keep up with every single case. I want you to think about this with me honestly. Surviving an attempt on your life rarely closes a chapter. It almost always opens a question. Either the person responsible was interrupted before finishing what they came to do, or the intent that night wasn't lethal at all. It was a message, and the message didn't land the way it was supposed to. If you're collecting a debt that's sized through violence, you don't usually shoot somebody once and walk away satisfied if they live. You escalate. You go back. 6 weeks is a meaningful gap. Long enough to relocate, long enough to negotiate, long enough to convince yourself the danger had finally passed. And then June happened anyway, on Franklin Road, in that car, just after 2 a.m. So now we're back to that number, and I want to give it to you with exactly the precision I'd want applied if I were the one being written about. According to someone who says they were personally close to Butler, he owed roughly $750,000 to a cartel. April, in this version, was a failed attempt to collect or punish him over it. June was that same attempt, finished properly the second time. I'm not going to tell you that's impossible, because structurally, it isn't far-fetched at all. An operation moving hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine through a mid-sized American city implies a supply chain reaching well past local distribution, almost certainly connecting back through networks tied to Mexican trafficking organizations somewhere along that line. One of Grundy's own co-defendants, a man named Gilberto Vizcarra-Millan, carried a name entirely consistent with that exact pipeline, and he was sentenced to 25 years in that same case. So the infrastructure for a debt like this to exist, somewhere downstream of that organization, it's genuinely plausible. I want to be honest with you about that much, but plausible is not confirmed, and I think you and I both know the difference matters. No law enforcement statement has named a cartel. No autopsy report has specified a motive. No court filing has attached a dollar figure to anything connected to his death. What actually exists right now is one uncorroborated claim from someone with no demonstrated investigative authority over this case, repeated by people online who weren't there either. I think that needs to be said plainly, because the second any channel covering true crime starts treating speculation as settled fact, it loses the only thing that makes it worth your time in the first place: your trust that what you're hearing is real. Here's what genuinely interests me, and I want you thinking through this with me rather than just taking my word for it. It isn't the debt theory itself that nags at me. It's the inconsistency sitting quietly inside it. Professional debt enforcement rarely fails decisively on a first attempt and then executes with precision exactly 6 weeks later. That's not typically how it works in organizations built around control and reputation. Either the same people miscalculated twice and corrected on the second try, or April and June were never actually part of the same story at all. It's entirely possible Butler was facing 2 separate threats from 2 unrelated directions at the same time. The debt, if it was real, tangled up with something else entirely. Maybe something tied to his earlier murder case. Maybe something tied to Grundy Crew's unraveling. Maybe something we haven't even considered yet. The version where it's all one continuous vendetta over a single number is simply the easier narrative to hold on to. It resolves cleanly instead of leaving us with loose ends. Does that make it less likely to be true, or just less satisfying? Those aren't always the same thing, and that's worth sitting with the next time a clean explanation feels like relief. So here's where this leaves us. Without forcing a resolution the evidence doesn't actually support yet. A man who maintained 2 parallel identities for most of his adult life, starting earlier than most people realize, going back to a gas station shooting at 22, all the way through a drug empire that moved hundreds of pounds of product through a city, all the way through an acquittal that should have given him a clean start. One identity built through genuine artistic accomplishment that real people genuinely connected with. The other rooted in a hierarchy that almost never allows a clean exit, no matter how badly somebody might want one. A first shooting that should have functioned as an unmistakable warning. A second shooting, weeks later, that ended his life on a quiet street most people will never think twice about driving past. And a debt, real or invented, that someone close to him is willing to attach a specific figure to without a shred of institutional confirmation behind it. I want to ask you something, and I'd genuinely like you to sit with it rather than answer too fast. If you owed somebody dangerous enough money, and you survived their first attempt to collect, what would you actually do with the 6 weeks you had left, without knowing they were your last 6 weeks? Would you have run? Would you have tried to negotiate? Would you have told the people closest to you what was actually happening? Or would you have done exactly what it looks like Eric Butler did, and simply kept living, kept performing, kept being Lil E in public, while something else entirely was closing behind the scenes? And when an investigation goes quiet the way this one has, why do we as an audience reach so fast for the most dramatic explanation available? Is it because that's genuinely where the evidence points, or because uncertainty is harder to carry than a story that resolves? I want to know what you think actually happened to Eric Butler. The cartel debt, exactly as described. An unrelated conflict nobody's named yet, maybe tied to his past. Something none of us have considered at all. Leave your theory in the comments. I read every single one of them. And if you want cases handled with this much care, where speculation gets clearly separated from what's actually confirmed, subscribe to Mystora Crimes. I'll see you in the next one.